welcome to this special edition of FPS Weekly, where instead of talking about the latest FPS news stories that are circling around the internets, I am instead talking about, in honor of our 10 Days of Star Wars event, Star Wars shooting games and how they've evolved over the years, and just, how, Star Wars games have really been kind of segmented out. And to start things off, I'm going to show some gameplay. Now, you're looking at it right now. I thought it was prudent to get rid of the face cam for this and only have the video and gameplay of the games in question to provide you guys with the best possible viewpoint. And excuse the poor quality. Remember that these videos are from the dark times of YouTube when HD videos, even 720p quality, wasn't really uploaded. So, I'll just keep that in mind. And anyway, start talking about is the game that we're looking at right now is known as Star Wars Dark Forces, which is part of the expanded universe and is no longer canon. But essentially, you play as a guy named Kyle Katarn, who is like a super badass Force user. He could do pretty much anything he wanted, very much like Starkiller in that respect. Also very much a great Jedi. But that's not really the point of this discussion. Star Wars Dark Forces came out in 1995, so it came out 20 years ago. So with Star Wars Dark Forces, it was a first-person shooter based kind of along the same lines as like Doom, Duke Nukem 3D, Rise of the Triad. You know those classic DOS games back in the early 90s that are just beginning to enter the foray of what it meant to be a first-person shooter. However, Star Wars games as shooters actually go back further than that. They actually go back to like Star Wars TIE Fighter, I think it was called, which was arguably the first Star Wars game. And that was also a shooter that was, not really a space simulator shooter, but it was a cockpit style shooter, like you're flying a TIE Fighter and you're shooting from that perspective. And basically, this kind of leads into an interesting trend if you look at the Star Wars games. How, if you look at that time period from like the late 80s through the most of the 90s, and then from the late 90s up to about 4 years ago, and to now again, you get this really interesting perspective of how Star Wars games have evolved. They started off as all primarily shooter games, and then later on in the late 90s you started getting games that were more like third person, less shootery, more adventure-y kind of things, like Episode 1 Pod Racer comes to mind. That didn't have any shooting in it, that was purely pod racing. Really old games that are still classic titles like Knights of the Old Republic, Star Wars Obi-Wan, all those kinds of games, The Force Unleashed, Star Wars Episode 3, all those were not shooters. And then starting like now, back to this year, we're moving back to Star Wars games being primarily shooters. And on top of that, we have the games like right now I think I've put up Republic Commando. This game came out in 2004 and is now also technically not canon because it doesn't follow the chronology of the Clone Wars. It's still an interesting game and still lends itself to shooting mechanics, obviously, being a first-person shooter. And really, it doesn't set the hallmark or foreground or anything for how Battlefront of this year is a shooter, or even like the cancelled Star Wars 1313, how that was a shooter and which was reportedly supposed to be about Boba Fett. Super disappointing that game was never made. But anyway, getting a little sidetracked here. So, even though these games graphically, they're not as impressive as they are as the games that are available today, you really do get to see just how things have changed, primarily. Because, you have this early segment of Star Wars games. They're all shooters, and then they move into being less shooter types, more adventure-ish kind of types, and now we're moving back to shooters. which is an interesting perspective just in general, and what I think it means in general for gaming and Star Wars gaming in general. I've said in general like 6 times already. That's really bad. As that things are just, you can't really predict how things are going to move and how things are going to change. Because I mean, like, I see, I think I put up Star Wars Battlefront now. Keep in mind I'm also doing this kind of like as cues for me in post-production and editing, so that things are a smooth process and I can actually put things in where it starts to make sense. As some old footage of Star Wars Battlefront 2 thrown in there as well for your enjoyment. This transition back to shooter games for the Star Wars genre is coherent with what people want nowadays out of games. Like, I know that people have said for like the past 3 or 4 years that the market has been completely saturated with shooters, but that's what people want now. People want shooters. They don't really want platformers. They don't really want these 3D action-adventure kind of games. Shooters are really driving that home as being about, as what this generation is really about. Take that as you may. I'm not really going to offer an opinion about it, because I don't really have an issue with it. And I don't really have an issue with 3D platformer action-adventure games in that regard. So my general opinion about this is just that you can't really predict how things are going to move and transform and change. But at the same time, you have these hopes and visions of what things are going to be. And like with Star Wars Battlefront, for example, people... I've seen a lot of people that are disappointed with the game. Like, they're saying it's Star Wars Battlefield, it's not Star Wars Battlefront. Having not really played the original Battlefront games, I don't know, perhaps I'm not really qualified to give my opinion on it. But even if that is true, where it's like, ooh, it's Star Wars Battlefield, it's not Star Wars Battlefront. Like, nah, Star Wars Battlefront's a lot more open, and it's like a sandbox, and you could do stuff in it, and it's fun. You can make your own scenarios and situations occur. I don't know what I was going for with that voice, like whiny, petulantness, I don't know, something along those lines. And yeah, just kinda, while that may be true, it doesn't take away from the fact, and it certainly doesn't detract from the fact that Star Wars Battlefront is the first really compelling Star Wars game in the last 5 years. I mean, yes, there are Star Wars The Old Republic, which I've played, and I actually have a few parts of the Let's Play I did before I stopped abruptly on my own channel. Hashtag shameless plug, but not really a shameless plug, but whatever. Man, I really love getting off topic, don't I? But yeah, so just kind of leading into that, like, Star Wars Battlefront, I don't really think is Star Wars Battlefield, because I have played the Battlefield games. At least I played the Battlefield Hardline beta, so I do have a little bit of perspective on it. And I don't really think it's Battlefield. I mean, yes, the physics of it are similar, but the way you get around the map and the way that things that you interact with stuff and wherever, it's totally not Battlefield. Maybe not Battlefront either. Like Battlefront being as it traditionally was 10 years ago. But you can't really expect it to be like it was traditionally 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, the entire market segment was completely different. 10 years ago, Star Wars Battlefront 2, for example, which had just come out, could be more readily classified as an action-adventure game than really a shooter. A shooter wasn't its primary focus, and that's kind of the point of this discussion, is that this year's Star Wars Battlefront is an attempt at a revival of Star Wars games. And in order for them to be revived, they have to be brought into the modern age. And that modern age, if you like it or not, is shooter games. And that's how it's going to be for the foreseeable future. Now, would I like an action-adventure based Star Wars game? Yes, I certainly would. That would be very, very interesting. But ultimately, that's not the overall market goal. The overall market goal is a first-person shooter or a third-person shooter, which Battlefront is obviously a combination of the two, since you can play in either perspective. And yeah, it's kind of all I really wanted to say and talk about this in regards to this special edition of FPS Weekly. Special because it is about Star Wars, and special also because it happens to be the 20th FPS Weekly. So, yeah, double special day for FPS Weekly today. FPS Weekly today. Sounds like a newspaper, doesn't it? Seriously. Anyway, this is Logical with Digital Dynasty as always, and I will be signing off. I will see you guys next week, returning back to normal news stories for FPS Weekly. Hopefully get some compelling stuff and things that are interesting. This has been my take on the Star Wars shooter games and how they've affected the development of Star Wars games and what it means for the Star Wars franchise as a whole. I will see you guys later.